Okay then folks, so last lesson on Russian agriculture we were looking at the condition of the peasants under the Tsars, in particular Alexander II and III. And if you remember, we looked at that picture showing a typical peasant's house at this time where they lived in one room basically. We looked at things like subsistence farming, so they only produced enough food to feed themselves. And of course, you should have remembered from previous work we'd done about the emancipation of the serfs and how, in many ways, although they were liberated, it kind of benefited the landowners more than the peasants themselves. Things like being given the worst land, redemptive payments, all of that type of stuff. What you also had to do was do that bit of reading from Orlando Figes, he's called, about the famine of 1891. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of it, but basically it was caused by a poor harvest, caused by weather conditions. It was an early frost and then a very dry spring or wet spring, or whatever it was. And at first the government refused to admit there was a famine. They euphemistically called it a poor harvest, and not very much was done regarding the famine for a good few months in 1891. Now, was that down to incompetence by the Tsarist regime? Was that down to deliberate kind of wanting to play it down? Was it perhaps a bit of both? That's a bit of a judgment call for you. What is clear, though, is that news of it did begin to reach St. Petersburg and Moscow and some other cities, and on the 17th of November, Alexander III issues an imperial order where he actually requests voluntary organisations help, and things like the Zemstva to help as well. So this is almost like a great admission, isn't it, that the government doesn't know what to do or cannot do it on its own. It's asking people in voluntary organisations, can you please come and help? And they do in loads, and you get loads of individuals helping. The great Russian author Tolstoy gets involved, the playwright, can't remember his name off the top of my head, Chemsky, whoever it is, he's a doctor, he goes to enlist. The Zemstva begin to press into action, and you have the so-called Zemstva men who appear. Interesting, one of whom was Prince Lvov, who actually becomes leader of the provisional government in 1917. So the famine highlights the real problems with agriculture. It also shows some of the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime, and it kind of suggests, or shows that the voluntary organisations were willing to help. Mr. Figes argues, I got the quote here, it activated and politicised by famine crisis. So in other words, he argues that the famine was the real big thing that politicised Russian society, and therefore he's suggesting, isn't it, that it's heading towards that revolution. Some of the seeds are being sown. Now, just thinking about your coursework for a moment, if say you're doing your coursework on the Russian Revolution, and you're talking about the causes, you've there got a historian's interpretation, haven't you? So if you agreed with it, you could say, of course, Orlando Figes is correct to argue, quote, it activated and politicised society, unquote, because, and then you give your evidence, wouldn't it, to say why Orlando Figes is right. If you find another historian who disagreed, you would say Orlando Figes has argued, quote, blah, 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 whereas Professor Smith has argued, quote, blah, blah, blah. Overall, it would appear that Figes or Smith is more accurate because. So I'll just give you a bit of a tip there for your coursework and just remind us how to do it. Okay then, so what I now want you to do is look at the reforms put in place under Nicholas II by a man called Stolypin. Stolypin, he becomes the president of the Council of Ministers after 1905. He essentially becomes Prime Minister to all, we're going to use kind of UK terminology. President of the Council of Ministers after 1905. So in other words, he's Nicholas's chief kind of advisor. And he comes in following the uprising of 1905. He's a fairly controversial character, uses a great deal of repression against the peasants and the industrial workers following that revolution. He's very harsh against opposition, and in fact there's a nickname for the hangman's noose, which was known as Stolypin's necktie. He does get assassinated in 1911. However, he does recognise reform has been made to agriculture. So he sees Witt's reforms to industry, which we'll look at in September, and he wants to reform agriculture. He basically argues, or he basically does it to preserve autocracy. He sees it that you suppress opposition and then you take away the seeds of the opposition by making life better. So he sees that there were some legitimate grievances of the peasants, and therefore he has a series of reforms he begins to initiate in order to try and deal with those causes of opposition. So therefore that would therefore preserve autocracy. So what we're going to do is, using the Lynch book, which is in the economy section of Moodle, you need to complete the diagram page thing about Stolypin's reforms. You should find out, the wage of the strong, it was called, and the land reforms and stuff. There's then like a summary page which looks at all the Tsars. Again, it's fairly straightforward. You have to think about any similarities and differences between the Tsars over how they dealt with the peasantry and agriculture. And then thirdly, I then want you to know the next page, which is about the First World War and agriculture. And for this, most information is in the Lynch book. Now, you have to go into the Impact of War section of Moodle, go to the First World War bit of that. I think it's called Lynch First World War. If I click on that, it's on the bottom side. It's on. You have to scroll through. I did write out the page number, and I've forgotten what I've done with it now. If you scroll down, you eventually come to it. It's called Food and Transport or something, and you should find the answers to the various stuff there regarding that. There's a little bit about the land question, which isn't in that section, but I've got the old copy of the textbook, so I'll take a photo of that page and I'll send it on an email to you all. So, by next Monday or something next week, if you get Stolypin's reform sorted, do the summary sheet on the Tsars and agriculture, and then do the First World War and Russian agriculture. Okay, there's a little bit of extra reading as well on Moodle to think about, was Stolypin the last hope for the Tsars and all that kind of stuff. Again, if you want to do a bit of extra reading, feel free to do that as well. So that will do until next week, and then next week we'll have a look at the communists and how they dealt with peasants and agriculture, and that side of things. There's a little bit more on the communists. There's quite a few juicy things which they did, shall we say.